Welcome to Mr. Horror, where we bring you the scariest stories on YouTube. Get ready to be terrified as we explore the darkest corners of the church. The church was old and ominous, looming over the small town like a dark cloud. Its walls were made of dark stone, and its windows were stained with colorful images of saints and martyrs. But despite its intimidating appearance, the townspeople had always felt a sense of comfort and safety within its walls. That is, until the strange occurrences began. It started with a feeling of unease, a sense that something was not quite right within the church. The air felt heavy, almost suffocating, and a sense of dread hung in the air like a thick fog. Then, the strange noises began. Footsteps echoed through the empty halls, even when no one was there. The sound of doors creaking open and shut could be heard, even when all the doors were locked. The townspeople tried to ignore it at first, chalking it up to their imaginations. But as the days went on, the occurrences grew more and more frequent. People started to whisper about the church being haunted, about the spirits of the dead still lingering within its walls. One night, as the local priest was closing up the church, he heard a strange sound coming from the altar. It was a low, guttural growl, like something out of a nightmare. The priest's heart raced as he cautiously approached the altar, not knowing what he would find. But what he saw there chilled him to the bone. Lying on the altar was a book, its pages filled with cryptic symbols and strange incantations. The air around the book was thick with an otherworldly energy, making the hairs on the back of the priest's neck stand on end. From that moment on, the church was never the same. Something dark and sinister had taken root within its walls, and the townspeople could feel it growing stronger with each passing day. As the strange occurrences at the church continued, the townspeople grew increasingly anxious. Some refused to enter the church altogether, while others could not resist the allure of solving the mystery. One night, a group of teenagers decided to explore the church, hoping to uncover the truth about the eerie sounds and strange happenings. They snuck into the church under the cover of darkness, their hearts racing with anticipation. As they made their way through the dark halls, they heard a faint whispering sound. At first, they thought it was just their imagination, but the whispering grew louder and more distinct. The group followed the sound to a room at the back of the church. The door was locked, but they managed to pick the lock and sneak inside. What they found inside the room was beyond anything they could have imagined. The walls were covered in strange symbols and markings, and there were candles burning on an altar at the center of the room. Suddenly, the candles flickered and went out, plunging the room into darkness. The teenagers screamed in terror as they heard the sound of footsteps approaching them from the darkness. They tried to flee, but it was too late. They were trapped, and they knew that they were not alone. As they huddled together in fear, a voice spoke to them from the darkness. "Welcome to my domain," the voice said. "You are mine now." The teenagers screamed in terror as they realized that they had stumbled upon something far more sinister than they had ever imagined. The teenagers were never seen again. The police searched the church and the surrounding areas, but there was no trace of them. It was as if they had vanished into thin air. The townspeople were left to wonder what had happened to them, but many believed that they had fallen victim to the dark presence that lingered within the church. Years passed, and the church remained abandoned. The townspeople avoided it at all costs, and those who did venture near it reported feeling a sense of dread and unease. But one day, a group of curious college students decided to explore the abandoned church. They had heard the rumors about its haunted past, and they couldn't resist the urge to investigate. As they made their way through the dark halls, they heard a strange whispering sound. It seemed to be coming from one of the rooms at the back of the church. The group cautiously approached the room, their hearts pounding with fear. When they entered the room, they saw a figure sitting at the altar, surrounded by candles. The figure turned to face them, and they gasped in horror as they realized what they were seeing. It was one of the missing teenagers, now a grown man. His eyes glowed with an otherworldly energy, and his voice was cold and menacing. "You should not have come here," he said. "Now you are mine." The college students tried to flee, but it was too late. They were trapped, and they knew that they were not alone. The church remained abandoned, a place of darkness and dread. The townspeople whispered about the strange occurrences that had happened there and the legends about the spirits that still lingered within its walls. But the truth was far more terrifying than anyone could have imagined. The dark presence that had taken root within the church was still there, waiting for its next victims to arrive. The church had always been a place of peace and solace for the small town. But as the years passed, strange things began to happen within its walls. At first, it was just a feeling of unease that crept over the townspeople when they entered the church. The air felt heavy and oppressive, and a sense of dread hung in the air like a thick fog. Then, the strange occurrences began. Footsteps echoed through the empty halls, even when no one was there. Doors creaked open and shut, and strange whispers could be heard in the darkness. Despite their fear, the townspeople tried to ignore it at first. They chalked it up to their imaginations, but as the strange occurrences grew more frequent, they could no longer deny that something was wrong. One night, a group of teenagers decided to sneak into the church and investigate. They crept through the dark halls, their hearts pounding with anticipation. As they approached the altar, they saw a figure standing in the shadows. They froze in fear as the figure stepped forward, revealing itself to be a ghostly apparition. The apparition was a nun, dressed in a long black habit. Her eyes were empty and lifeless, and her face was twisted into a grotesque sneer. The teenagers tried to flee, but the nun was too fast. She chased them through the halls of the church, her cold, bony hands reaching out to grab them. Finally, the teenagers managed to escape, but the image of the ghostly nun haunted them for years to come. They knew that something dark and sinister had taken root within the church, and that they were not safe within its walls. The town was in a state of panic after the encounter with the ghostly nun. People avoided the church at all costs, and those who did venture near it reported feeling a sense of dread and unease. But one day, a group of paranormal investigators arrived in town. They had heard about the strange occurrences at the church, and they were determined to uncover the truth. As they set up their equipment and began to explore the church, they felt the weight of the oppressive atmosphere. The air was thick with an otherworldly energy, and the sounds of footsteps and whispers echoed through the halls. But as they approached the altar, they felt the energy intensify. The room grew colder, and a feeling of malevolence filled the air. Suddenly, one of the investigators was pulled backwards, his body contorting in pain. He screamed as he felt something cold and ghostly wrap itself around his throat. The other investigators tried to help him, but they were too late. He was dead, and they knew that they were in grave danger. As they fled the church, they could hear the sound of maniacal laughter echoing through the halls. It was as if the ghostly nun was mocking them, taunting them with their own mortality. The investigators never returned to the church, but the ghostly nun remained there, waiting for her next victim. The town was left to wonder what had happened to the investigators, but many believed that they had fallen prey to the dark and malevolent force that had taken root within the church. The church remained abandoned, a place of darkness and dread. No one dared to enter its walls for fear of what they might find. But one night, a group of teenagers decided to explore the church. They had heard the rumors of the ghostly nun and the paranormal investigators, but they were convinced that it was all just a hoax. As they made their way through the dark halls, they heard a faint whispering sound. It seemed to be coming from the altar. When they approached the altar, they saw the ghostly figure of the nun. She was more malevolent and powerful than ever before, her eyes glowing with an otherworldly energy. The teenagers tried to flee, but the nun was too fast. She chased them through the halls of the church, her cold, bony hands reaching out to grab them. Finally, they reached the exit, but the doors were locked. They were trapped, and they knew that they were not alone. As they huddled together in fear, they heard the sound of maniacal laughter. It was the laughter of the ghostly nun, mocking them with their own mortality. But then, something strange happened. The laughter stopped, and the ghostly figure of the nun began to fade away. The teenagers were left standing in the empty church, their hearts pounding with fear. They knew that they had narrowly escaped death, and they knew that they would never forget the horror that they had witnessed. From that moment on, the church was never the same. The townspeople avoided it at all costs, knowing that something dark and malevolent still lingered within its walls. The legend of the ghostly nun became a cautionary tale, a reminder of the dangers that lurked in the darkness. The old church stood atop the hill, looming over the small town like a dark and ominous presence. It had been abandoned for years, its doors locked tight and its windows boarded up. But as the years passed, strange stories began to circulate among the townspeople. They spoke of strange noises coming from the church, of flickering lights and shadowy figures lurking within its walls. At first, people dismissed the stories as nothing more than gossip, but as the strange occurrences grew more frequent, they could no longer deny that something was wrong. One day, a group of teenagers decided to sneak into the church and investigate. They crept through the dark halls, their hearts pounding with fear. As they made their way through the church, they heard strange whispers and creaking noises. It was as if the old building was alive and it was watching them. But then they heard a faint singing sound. It was a beautiful voice, but there was something off about it. It was cold and lifeless, like it was coming from beyond the grave. The teenagers followed the sound, and it led them to a room at the back of the church. When they entered the room, they saw a figure standing at the altar, dressed in a long black robe. It was a priest, but there was something wrong with him. His eyes were cold and empty, and his face was twisted into a grotesque sneer. As the teenagers approached him, the priest turned to face them. They gasped in horror as they saw his face. It was covered in blood, and his eyes were glowing with an otherworldly energy. Without warning, the priest lunged at them, his cold, bony fingers reaching out to grab them. The teenagers tried to flee, but it was too late. They were trapped in the church with the ghostly priest, and they knew that they were not alone. The teenagers were trapped in the church with the ghostly priest, his cold and lifeless hands reaching out to grab them. They tried to run, but the doors were locked and the windows were too high to reach. They were trapped with no way out. As they huddled together in fear, the ghostly priest began to speak. His voice was cold and menacing, and it sent shivers down their spines. He told them that the church was cursed, that it was a gateway to the underworld. He said that the spirits of the dead were trapped within its walls, and that they were angry and vengeful. The teenagers listened in horror as the ghostly priest spoke. They knew that he was not of this world, and that he was there to punish them for their trespass. Suddenly, the room grew colder, and a feeling of dread filled the air. The ghostly priest's eyes began to glow brighter, and his voice grew louder. The teenagers could hear the sound of chanting coming from outside the church. It was a chorus of voices singing a mournful dirge. As the chanting grew louder, the ghostly priest began to change. His skin turned black, and his eyes grew larger and more sinister. The teenagers could feel the ground beneath them shaking, and they knew that something terrible was about to happen. They closed their eyes and prayed for salvation, but they knew that it was too late. The next thing they knew, they were thrown across the room as if by an invisible force. They were unconscious, and they knew that they were never going to forget the horror they had experienced in that cursed church. When the teenagers finally came to, they were outside the church, lying in a heap on the cold, hard ground. They could feel the cold night air on their skin, and they knew that they had been spared by the ghostly priest. As they looked up at the church, they saw that it was glowing with an otherworldly energy. It was as if the spirits of the dead were still trapped within its walls, waiting to exact their revenge on anyone who dared to trespass. The teenagers knew that they had narrowly escaped death, and they knew that they would never forget the horror that they had witnessed. They stumbled back to town, their hearts pounding with fear, and they told their story to anyone who would listen. From that day on, the church was avoided at all costs. It became a place of darkness and dread, a symbol of the horrors that lurked in the darkness. The legend of the ghostly priest lived on, a reminder of the dangers that lay hidden in the shadows. And the teenagers who had survived the encounter with him knew that they had been changed forever, scarred by the experience in ways that they could never fully comprehend. The cursed church remained abandoned, a place of darkness and death. And the spirits of the dead continued to haunt its halls, waiting for their next victim. Thanks for watching our 3 scary true horror stories. We hope you enjoyed these true scary church stories and that they left you feeling suitably terrified. If you want to see more videos like this, be sure to like and subscribe to our channel. And don't forget to hit the bell notification so you never miss an upload. Thanks again for joining us on this journey through the darkest corners of the supernatural. Until next time, stay safe and watch out for the things that go bump in the night.